Think about the oldest thing you have ever touched. Maybe it was a stone pulled from the earth in a garden, rounded smooth by a river that no longer exists. Maybe it was a beam of wood in an old house, worn dark by 1,000 hands before yours. Maybe it was something smaller, coin, a key, a fragment of pottery. Whatever it was, there was a moment, wasn't there, when you held it and felt something quiet move through you, a kind of pause, a sense that the ordinary rules of time had softened just slightly, and for one still breath, you were connected to something much, much larger than yourself. Now imagine holding an entire mountain range. Imagine running your hand along a wall that stretches for thousands of miles, winding over peaks and dropping into valleys, crossing deserts and climbing ridges, threading through landscapes so vast and remote that even today most people will never stand there. Imagine that this wall was built not in a single moment of grand ambition, but slowly, painstakingly, generation after generation, over more than 2,000 years. Imagine the millions of hands that shaped it, the millions of feet that walked beside it, the millions of ordinary lives, farmers, soldiers, labourers, merchants, mothers, children, that were lived in its shadow. That wall exists. It is the Great Wall of China. And if you have ever wondered what it was really like, not the postcards, not the famous photograph of tourists winding up a stone staircase on a clear autumn morning, but the real thing, the living, breathing history of it, the long, slow human story behind it, then you have come to exactly the right place. Tonight we're going to walk that wall together, not quickly, not with dates and dynasties rattled off like a list. We're going to take our time. We're going to move the way the people who built it moved, slowly, deliberately, one stone at a time. We will start long before the wall existed, in the early farming villages that rose along China's rivers thousands of years ago. We will move through the centuries with quiet care, through the reasons the wall was needed, through the unimaginable effort it took to build it, through the everyday life that unfolded around it. We will follow the merchants and the soldiers and the farmers and the traders who passed through its gates. We will listen to the wind that still moves across its watchtowers today. This is not a story about conquest or warfare, though those things exist at the edges of it. This is a story about something older and quieter than that. It is a story about the human need to feel safe, about the deep, ancient desire to protect the people you love and the life you have carefully built, about the way that desire, when held by enough people for long enough, can move mountains, or at least build walls along the tops of them. So let the day go. Let whatever it brought you, the noise, the tasks, the small anxieties that hum beneath everything, let all of that drift back. You don't need to hold on to any of it right now. There is nowhere you need to be. Nothing that needs doing. Just this voice, and this story, and thousands of years of quiet human history waiting patiently ahead of us. We begin in stone, we begin in wind, we begin at the wall. To understand why the wall was built, you have to understand the land it was built to protect. And to understand the land, you have to go back a very long way, much further back than emperors and dynasties, back to a time before any wall existed at all, when the territory we now call China was simply a vast ancient landscape of mountains and rivers and plains, and the people who lived there were learning, slowly and patiently, how to make it home. Let us begin beside a river. The Yellow River, the Chinese call it the Huanghe, is one of the great rivers of the world. It rises in the high, cold plateau of western China and travels nearly 3,000 miles before emptying into the sea. It carries with it an enormous amount of yellow silt, the fine mineral dust of the upland Lues plateaus it cuts through, and that silt is what gives the river its name and its colour. this long winding ribbon of gold and brown moving through the heart of the land. Stand on its bank in spring, and the water is the colour of strong tea, thick and moving, carrying the sediment of mountains you cannot see. For the earliest farming communities of ancient China, this river was everything. It was the source of life, quite literally. The silt the river deposited on its banks during the annual floods was extraordinarily fertile, rich, dark, full of the minerals and nutrients that crops need to grow. The river flooded regularly, sometimes violently, and those floods were feared and respected in equal measure. They could destroy a village in an afternoon. They could also, over time, leave behind soil so rich that a single acre of it could feed a family for a year. People learned to read the river. They learned where it tended to flood and where it was gentler. They learned the rhythm of its seasons, the swelling in spring as the mountain snows melted, the drawing back in late summer, the long quiet of winter when the water ran low and slow. And around this rhythm they built their lives. They planted millet in the spring, tending it through the long warm months, harvesting it in the autumn before the cold arrived. They kept pigs and dogs. They made pottery from the yellow clay of the riverbanks, round bowls and storage jars decorated with simple patterns, red and black geometric designs that are among the most beautiful things the ancient world produced. This was roughly 7,000 years ago. Perhaps a little more, perhaps a little less. The people we're talking about are the Yangsha culture, named for the village in Henan province where their remains were first discovered in the 1920s. They lived in small communities, mostly along the middle reaches of the Yellow River and its tributaries. Their houses were simple, round or rectangular structures dug slightly into the earth for warmth, with walls of wattle and daub and roofs of thatch. Not so different, really, from what you would find in early farming communities anywhere in the world at that time, but there was something here in the particular richness of this land and the particular character of the people who settled it that would become the foundation of one of the most enduring civilizations in human history. Picture a village in late summer just before the harvest. The millet is tall and heavy-headed, rippling in the warm wind. Children chase each other between the rows. Older women sit near the hearth fires, shaping clay with their hands, turning a lump of earth into something useful and beautiful. Men come in from the fields, carrying tools, their feet dusty from the path. Dogs sprawl in the shade of the houses. There is the smell of cooking, something savoury and slow, a broth with millet and roots and whatever the hunters brought back this week. There is the sound of laughter from somewhere. The river is not far away. You can hear it, a low continuous murmur beneath everything, the way a heartbeat runs beneath all the sounds of a living body. This is not a dramatic scene. It is not a scene you would put in a movie. But this ordinary, unhurried, summer evening human life is where the story of the Great Wall begins. Not with an emperor, not with a battle, but with people choosing where to plant their millet and build their houses and raise their children. People deciding, in the way that all people have always decided, this is our place. This is where we belong. Over the centuries, these communities grew and changed. The Yangshao culture gave way to the Longshan culture, roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. The Longshan people were in many ways more sophisticated. They built larger settlements, kept more livestock, produced extraordinary black pottery that was so thin-walled it was almost translucent. They traded over longer distances, developed more complex social hierarchies, began to construct more elaborate burial practices that tell us a great deal about how they thought about life and death, and what came after. And along with all of this, they began to build walls. Not the Great Wall, not yet. These were small things by comparison. Earthen ramparts around village perimeters, a few feet high, a few feet thick. The kind of barrier that would stop a curious animal, delay a raiding party, mark the boundary between what belonged to the community and what lay outside it. In archaeological sites from this period, researchers have found the traces of these early walls preserved in the earth, compressed layers of rammed earth, tamped down by repeated blows until it was almost as hard as stone, laid up in courses that are still visible if you know what to look for. The technique these early builders used is called hangtu in Chinese, which translates roughly as pounded earth. It involves filling a wooden frame with loose earth or clay, then beating it down with heavy wooden or stone tools until it compresses into a dense, solid layer. Then you fill the frame again, pound it down again, lift the frame up, fill it again, pound it again. It is slow, laborious work. It requires large numbers of people working together in a kind of rhythm, a communal effort, almost like a song, the thud of the pounders marking time. But the result is remarkably strong. Walls built this way have survived for thousands of years in the dry climate of northern China. Some of the earliest ones can still be found today, low mounds in fields and riverbeds, almost invisible unless you are specifically looking for them. These small walls were not built in fear, exactly. They were built in the same spirit that a farmer builds a fence, to mark the edge of something, to contain and define a space, to say quietly but clearly, "This is ours, and we care for it." The impulse to draw a boundary around what you value is one of the oldest human impulses there is. It goes back much further than any written history, much further than any monument. It is in the bone of human civilization. But something was changing slowly in the centuries between these early farming villages and the great unified empire that would eventually order the building of the wall we know today. The communities along the Yellow River were growing larger and more complex. They were developing systems of governance, systems of ritual, systems of writing. They were forging bronze, that remarkable alloy of copper and tin that transforms the human relationship with metal, and therefore with tools and weapons and power. They were creating what would become, over long centuries of gradual development, a civilization of extraordinary richness and depth. The Yellow River Valley was not the only place this was happening. Further south, the Yangtze River had its own communities, its own agricultural traditions, its own slow accumulation of culture. Rice was being cultivated in the warm, wet south. Silk was being produced, that miraculous thread pulled from the cocoon of a small moth that would one day become one of the most valuable commodities on earth. Jade was being carved into tools and ornaments and ritual objects of great beauty. The land was alive with human activity, human creativity, human ambition. But it was also alive with something else, something that required attention, something that the people in their river valley settlements could not quite ignore, no matter how productively they farmed their fields and how beautifully they decorated their pottery. To the north and west of the farming communities stretched something very different, the steppe. The steppe is hard to imagine if you've never been to it or anything like it. It is not a jungle, not a forest, not a desert. Though it borders all of these things at various points, it is vast, open grassland, hundreds of thousands of square miles of it, rolling and flat and windswept, stretching from the shores of Eastern Asia all the way to the plains of Eastern Europe. In summer it is yellow and green, the grass bending in long waves, under a sky that seems too large and too bright. In winter it is white, the snow driven horizontal by a wind that has nothing to stop it for 1,000 miles. The steppe is a world built for movement, and the people who lived on it were movers. They followed the grass because the grass fed their herds, and their herds fed them. Cattle, horses, sheep. These were the wealth and the life of the steppe peoples. Not fields, not fixed harvests, not pottery kilns or silkworm cocoons, but animals. Living, moving, breathing animals that required space and grass and water, and that in turn gave their keepers meat and milk and hides, and the power of mobility that no farmer, rooted to his field, could match. We're going to talk much more about these steppe people and the relationship between them and the farming civilizations of ancient China very soon, but for now, just hold this image. The farmers, settled and rooted, looking north over the edge of their cultivated world at the great brown horizon of the steppe. The herders, mobile and far-ranging, moving south in the hard months, eyes on the green edge of the farming lands. Two worlds, two entirely different ways of being human, and between them, for now, only the open air. That open air would not be enough for long. First, though, let us stay a little longer in the river valleys, because the story of what grows there, the cities and the kings and the slow gathering of power and authority and cultural identity, is the story of everything that comes after, and it is a story worth taking time with. The Shang dynasty, which emerged along the Yellow River roughly 3,500 years ago, is the first Chinese civilization for which we have extensive written records. The Shang people used a form of writing we recognize as directly ancestral to modern Chinese characters, inscriptions on oracle bones, the shoulder blades of cattle and the shells of turtles, used in divination rituals to communicate with ancestors and spirits. These oracle bone inscriptions tell us an enormous amount about Shang life, about their kings and their wars, their rituals and their anxieties, their harvests and their sacrifices. The Shang capital, archaeologists believe it was located near present-day Anyang in Henan province, was a substantial city by the standards of its time. Surrounded by walls of rammed earth that stretched for miles, it contained large ceremonial buildings, royal tombs of astonishing richness, workshops where bronze casters produced vessels of extraordinary technical skill and artistic beauty. The bronzes of the Shang dynasty, deep ritual vessels covered in elaborate patterns of dragons and faces and birds, are among the great achievements of early human art. You can hold one in a museum today, 3,000 years after it was cast, and feel the weight of the world that made it. But here, in the Shang world, something else is beginning to appear in the historical record. References to peoples to the north and west. Names that appear in the oracle bones like a distant rumble. The Guifang, the Tufang, the Qiang. Peoples who were not farmers. Peoples who moved with their herds and struck in ways that were hard to predict or defend against. The Shang kings launched military campaigns against these groups. They captured prisoners and incorporated them, sometimes violently, into their ritual and agricultural world. This tension is old, older than the Shang. It runs like a fault line through all of early Chinese history, the friction between the settled agricultural world of the river valleys and the mobile pastoral world of the steppe. It does not resolve, it deepens, it shapes, over centuries and millennia, the very geography of civilization, where people built, and what they built, and why. The small village walls of the Neolithic farmers, the large city walls of the Shang, and still, far to the north, the open steppe and the wind moving through the grass. The idea of a wall is already there. It has been there for a very long time. It is waiting, as ideas sometimes do, for the moment when the need becomes large enough to carry it. There is a question that seems simple but turns out to be surprisingly deep, and it is this. Why is a farmer different from a herder? The obvious answer is the one you already know. A farmer grows crops. A herder keeps animals. But if you sit with that for a moment, you start to see that the difference goes much further than what a person does for food. It reaches all the way down into how a person thinks about land, about time, about ownership, about what the good life looks like and what it requires. A farmer needs stability. A farmer needs to plant in spring and harvest in autumn, and that means being in the same place for all the months in between. A farmer needs to protect a field from the moment the seeds go in the ground. A farmer builds a house because it will be there next year, and the year after that, and the year after that. A farmer builds a barn, a granary, a well. A farmer accumulates things, tools, stores of food, furniture, objects, because all of these things will still be useful in the same place next season. A farmer, over generations, becomes deeply attached to a specific piece of land. This hillside, this bend in the river, this particular view of the mountains in the morning, the land is not just where food comes from. It is identity. It is story. It is home. A herder needs something different. A herder needs movement. The grass that was good last spring is grazed out by late summer, and the herd must move to find more. In winter, the herd must move to where there is shelter, or where the snow is thin enough to pour through to the dry grass beneath. A herder cannot build heavy structures because the herd will be somewhere else next month. A herder's shelter, the felt yurt, the portable tent of skins and wooden poles, is a miracle of mobile design, warm and waterproof and quick to dismantle. A herder's wealth is in the herd, in the animals themselves, which are living and moving and require constant attention and skill to maintain. A herder develops extraordinary knowledge of landscape and weather and animal behaviour, the kind of knowledge that no book can contain, that lives only in the body, in the years of practice, in the stories passed from elder to child beside the fire. Neither way of life is better. Both require tremendous skill and knowledge and effort. Both have produced great cultures, great art, great systems of belief and meaning. But they do create people who look at the world very differently. A farmer looks at a field and sees years of labour embedded in it, sees the cleared stones, the tilled rows, the carefully maintained irrigation channels, sees the future harvest already implicit in the present soil. Something inside a farmer says, this must be protected. This cannot be taken. A herder looks at a field and sees, perhaps, good grass that is going to waste, sees a resource that is available right now to someone who can use it. A herder's entire relationship to the land is based on use and movement, not ownership in the fixed, legal, written-down sense that a farmer understands. Ownership in a different way, the ownership of access, of skill, of knowing how to live from what the land offers. You can see already how these two worldviews can come into friction, not because either side is wicked or aggressive by nature, but because they have fundamentally incompatible relationships with the same land. Now add the reality of survival. The steppe is generous in good years and brutal in bad ones. When the rains fail and the grass does not grow and the herds begin to thin, the steppe peoples had limited choices. They could move further, searching for better pasture. They could trade, and trade they did, often and extensively with the farming settlements to the south. Or, in the hardest times, they could take, and the farming communities for their part were rich in exactly the things the steppe lacked in bad years: grain, stored food, the predictable surplus that settled agriculture allows. From the outside, a Chinese farming village in a good harvest year would have looked prosperous almost beyond imagining to someone whose herds were dying in a drought. Granaries full of millet, pigs fattening in their pens, houses solid and warm, gardens growing in the shelter of earthen walls. This is not a story of simple villains and victims. It is much more complicated and more human than that. The relationship between the farming communities of ancient China and the pastoral peoples of the steppe was, for most of its history, a relationship of trade and exchange and occasional mutual benefit, as much as it was one of conflict. Silken grain moved north in exchange for horses and cattle and furs. Goods and ideas and people moved back and forth across the boundary between the two worlds for thousands of years. But the boundary itself was a problem, because there was no clear line. No river deep enough or mountain range high enough or desert wide enough to mark unambiguously where the farming world ended and the steppe world began. The boundary shifted with the seasons and the centuries. Farming settlements crept north in good years, retreated south when the climate cooled. Steppe peoples pushed south when drought hit, fell back when the rains returned. The frontier between these two worlds was not a line. It was a zone. Wide, contested, constantly negotiated, sometimes through trade and sometimes through force. It is into this zone that the wall would eventually be built. But we are still not there yet. We are still several centuries away from the first Great Wall, still in the slow gathering of conditions that would make it necessary. So let us follow the history a little further. After the Shang came the Zhou, a long dynasty, the longest in Chinese history by most reckonings, lasting from roughly the 11th century before the Common Era to the 3rd. The Zhou period is in many ways the philosophical and cultural foundation of classical Chinese civilization. It was during the Zhou era that Confucius lived and taught, that remarkable philosopher whose ideas about right conduct, social harmony, and the duties owed between people of different relationships would shape Chinese thought for more than 2,000 years. It was during the Zhou era that the great military strategist Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War, that spare and luminous text about the nature of conflict that remains one of the most read books in the world today. It was during the Zhou era that many of the literary, artistic, and ritual traditions that define classical Chinese culture took their recognizable form. But the Zhou era was also, especially in its later centuries, a time of fragmentation and violence. The Zhou kingdom gradually lost central control, and power devolved to a constellation of semi-independent states that competed, often militarily, for territory and resources. This period, which historians call the Warring States period, lasted from roughly the 5th to the 3rd centuries before the Common Era. It was one of the most creative and most violent eras in Chinese history simultaneously, which is not unusual. Extremity tends to concentrate the mind. During the Warring States period, something new appears in the landscape of ancient China, something that is a direct ancestor of the Great Wall we know today. Individual states began to build walls, not just city walls, not just the earthen ramparts around villages and capitals that had always existed. These were something different. Long linear walls, running for miles and miles across the landscape, designed not to enclose a city but to mark and defend a border. The state of Wei built a wall along its western frontier in the 4th century before the Common Era. The states of Zhao and Yan built walls along their northern borders, facing the steppe. The state of Qin, the most powerful of the warring states, the one whose king would eventually become the first emperor of a unified China, built walls on its northern and western frontiers as well. These walls were built using the same rammed earth technique that the Neolithic farmers had used for their village ramparts, but on a vastly larger scale. Organised labour directed by state authority. Thousands of workers, free labourers, conscripted farmers, convicted criminals, driving their pounders down into the wooden frames course by course, mile by mile. Watchtowers at intervals where soldiers could see for miles across the open steppe. Gates and checkpoints where movement between the two worlds could be monitored and controlled. These early walls varied in quality and permanence. Some were sturdy and well built, others were more modest, earthen banks that served as much as symbolic markers as actual military barriers. In the drier northern climate, the rammed earth lasted reasonably well. You can still find remnants of some of these early walls today, eroded and worn but still present in the landscape, like the spines of ancient creatures half buried in dust. But here is what is important about these early walls, and here is something that often gets forgotten in the popular imagination of the Great Wall. They were not primarily about fear, they were about management. Think about what a long wall actually does, practically speaking. It does not stop a determined large army. A truly motivated and organised military force can always find a way around, or through a linear barrier, given time and resources. The history of walls is partly the history of armies finding ways past walls. The Chinese strategists who ordered these walls built knew this. They were not naive. They were not hoping that some magical barrier of earth and stone would make the steppe peoples simply go away. What a wall does is something more subtle and more useful than that. It controls the points of crossing. Where there is no wall, people and animals can move across the frontier at any of 1,000 unmarked spots, invisible and unmonitored. Where there is a wall with gates, you know where the crossings are. You can position your soldiers at those points. You can collect tolls from traders. You can turn back raiders before they get deep into your territory, rather than having to chase them after the fact. You can, in other words, manage the relationship between the two worlds, rather than simply being subject to it. The wall was a tool of governance as much as a tool of defence. It was a way of saying, clearly and permanently, here is where our world begins. If you wish to enter it, you come through our gates on our terms. Now, if you are listening to this at the end of a long day, finding this place of quiet and history exactly what you needed tonight, it would mean a great deal if you tapped the like button and subscribe to the channel. It takes just a moment and it genuinely helps bring these kinds of long, slow journeys to more people who might be searching for exactly this kind of peace. You can do it now or later, or whenever feels right. Either way, I'm glad you're here. Back to the wall. There was something else driving the construction of these early walls, something that goes even deeper than military strategy or administrative practicality. It was cultural. It was about identity. By the time of the Warring States period, the people of the Yellow River Valley and the broader landscape of ancient China had been farming their land for thousands of years. They had accumulated language and literature, ritual and philosophy, art and music, and a rich, complex understanding of their own history. They had a sense, deep and abiding, of being a particular kind of people, a settled, cultivated, civilized people, with a word for themselves that meant something like the people of the central flourishing. Against this self-image, the people of the steppe represented something different. Not necessarily something threatening in the simple sense of being dangerous, but something alien, a different kind of life, a different relationship to the land, a different set of values and practices. The wall, in this sense, was not just a military barrier or an administrative tool. It was a statement about difference, about identity, about the boundary between one world and another. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is one of the things that makes the Great Wall such a uniquely human monument. It was built by practical people solving practical problems. It was also built by people working out, in stone and earth and labour, something that they felt in their bones. The need to define a space to say this is us, and this is our home. Those two things, the practical and the symbolic, are almost never separate in the great works that human beings produce. The cathedral is also engineering. The bridge is also beauty. The wall is also a monument to the desire to be safe, to be known, to stand somewhere and say, here. Now, as we move forward in this story, the fragmented world of the warring states is approaching its end. Something large is coming, a tide of change that would reshape the entire landscape of ancient China, that would bring all these individual walls and states and peoples into a single frame for the first time. A man is coming, or rather, a force is gathering that will change everything. But before that force arrives, let us sit one more moment in the earlier world, in the soft quietness before the transformation. Let us think about what a frontier village in northern China felt like 300 years before the Common Era, in the century or so before Qin Shi Huang unified the land. You live in a settlement not far from the base of a rammed earth wall. The wall runs east and west as far as you can see, perhaps 10 feet high, its surface weathered and dusty, clumps of dry grass growing from the cracks near the top. Beyond it, to the north, the land changes, less cultivated, more open, the horizon wider and more uncertain. You have never been beyond the wall, not really, not far. Your world is the village, the fields, the river a few miles south, the market town a day's walk away. But the wall is part of your life in ways that are almost invisible because they are so constant. The soldiers in the watchtower above the nearest gate are familiar faces, men from other villages mostly, doing their year of military service. Sometimes you bring them food, sometimes they tell you things about what they saw from the tower. A dust cloud in the distance that might mean a large herd moving south, a fire at night far out on the steppe. These things are passed down to the village headman, who passes them to the officials, who pass them up and up along the chain of command. There is trade at the gate sometimes. Herders come to sell cattle or horses, to buy grain or silk or bronze tools. It is tense sometimes, this exchange. There are language barriers, misunderstandings, old grievances on both sides. But it happens. It has always happened. The wall does not stop the exchange of things or people. It just shapes it, gives it a structure, makes it happen in a particular place and in a particular way. Your children play near the wall. They throw stones at the lizards that live in its cracks. They do not think about what the wall means or why it was built. To them it is simply part of the landscape, as natural and permanent as the hills, as permanent as anything can be. They do not know that everything is about to change. History has a way of arriving without warning signs. You do not usually feel in the moment that you're living through a turning point. The farmer in his field does not stand up one morning, look around and think, "Today the world I know ends." He just continues doing what he has always done, because most days are like most other days, and the machinery of change works slowly, and then, sometimes, all at once. The unification of China under the Qin dynasty was one of those all-at-once moments. By the 3rd century before the Common Era, the state of Qin had been growing in power and sophistication for over a century. It had reorganized its government along strictly rational bureaucratic lines. It had reformed its military, training and equipping a professional army that operated with a discipline and effectiveness that the other warring states could not match. It had built roads and canals that allowed it to move troops and supplies with extraordinary speed. It had, in short, done everything right, everything that a state needs to do to project power far beyond its borders. And in the year 221 before the Common Era, the king of Qin completed what the other states had dreaded, and some had seen coming for years. One by one, he had absorbed the remaining warring states into his empire. The last holdouts fell. The wars that had been consuming China for centuries went quiet. The fragmented, competing world of the warring states was over. In its place stood something new and unprecedented, a unified empire stretching across the length and breadth of China, governed from a single capital, under a single ruler. That ruler was a man history knows as Qin Shi Huang. His given name was Ying Zheng, and he had become king of Qin at the age of 13, ascending the throne as a boy and growing into it over 2 decades of war and politics and relentless ambition. Now, at 39, he was master of an empire larger than any that had existed in China before, and he was not content to simply call himself a king. He needed a title equal to what he had achieved. He blended 2 ancient words, the word for a legendary sage ruler and the word for a divine sovereign, and created something new, Huangdi, emperor. He would be the first emperor. He made sure everyone understood this. It is easy, looking back from the distance of more than 2 millennia, to flatten Qin Shi Huang into a simple figure, the cold, imperious ruler who sent armies of workers to their deaths, building a wall in the mountains. History has often rendered him that way, and there is some truth in it. He was ruthless. He was authoritarian in ways that went far beyond anything the kings of the warring states had attempted. He burned books, a famous and genuinely terrible act, a deliberate destruction of the literary and philosophical heritage of the earlier kingdoms, an attempt to break the hold of the old ideas and replace them with the ideas of his own empire. He buried scholars alive, or so the later sources tell us, though the details of this are disputed. He was capable of spectacular cruelty. But he was also, by any measure, one of the most consequential figures in human history. The unification he achieved did not collapse after his death, as many contemporaries might have expected. The dynasty he founded lasted only 15 years, a remarkably brief span for so colossal an achievement. But the idea of a unified China, governed from a centre, organised according to common laws and standards and administrative principles, proved astonishingly durable. That idea survived the fall of the Qin, survived dynasty after dynasty, survived conquest and fragmentation and civil war and foreign occupation. It is still, in some form, present in the world today. That is the measure of what Qin Shi Huang created. But we are not here to pass judgment on the first emperor. We're here to follow a stone. Because in the years immediately following unification, Qin Shi Huang turned his attention north, to the old problem that every ruler of any northern Chinese state had always eventually had to face: the steppe people, the Xiongnu, as the Chinese sources of this period called them, a confederation of nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples who ranged across the grasslands north of China's settled lands and who, in the years of the warring states, had grown in organisation and power. The early Han Dynasty sources describe the Xiongnu in ways that are clearly coloured by political anxiety and cultural prejudice, fearsome horsemen, implacable raiders, a faceless northern threat. The reality, as archaeology and more recent scholarship has shown, was far more complex. The Xiongnu had sophisticated social and political structures. They maintained extensive trade networks. They produced beautiful art, elaborate bronze and gold objects in what scholars call the animal style, depicting horses and deer and predators in dynamic flowing designs. They were not a horde. They were a civilization different from the civilization of the Yellow River valleys, but no less real. But the tension between the two worlds was real too. And for Qin Shi Huang, fresh from the unification of all of China under a single rule, the northern frontier was both a vulnerability and an opportunity. A vulnerability because the Xiongnu's raiding capacity was a genuine threat to the northern farming settlements. An opportunity because solving this problem, decisively, permanently, in the way he had solved everything else, would demonstrate the power and permanence of the new empire. His solution was characteristically grand. He sent his greatest general Meng Tian north with an army of 300,000 soldiers to push the Xiongnu back from the frontier. Meng Tian succeeded in driving them north, reclaiming territory that had been lost, and then, having pushed the boundary back, Qin Shi Huang gave Meng Tian his next assignment: connect the walls. The individual walls that the warring states had built along their northern frontiers, the walls of Zhao, of Yan, of Qin itself, were still there, though in various states of repair and completeness. They ran at different angles in different styles, with gaps between them where no state had thought to build, or where the terrain had made building difficult. Individually, they were useful, but they were not unified. They did not present a single coherent line. To walk the frontier of a unified empire with a patchwork of disconnected barriers was, to the mind of the first emperor, an insult to the idea of unity itself. He wanted one wall. He wanted it to run from the sea in the east to the desert in the west. He wanted it to follow the natural line of the terrain, the ridges of mountains where mountains existed, the edge of plateaus and valleys where the landscape provided its own logical boundaries. He wanted it to incorporate the old walls where they were sound, rebuild them where they had fallen, extend them where the line had gaps. He wanted, in other words, to place a single great seam across the top of his empire, defining it from one end to the other, and so Meng Tian, with his 300,000 soldiers, many of whom transitioned from being an army of conquest to being an army of construction, set to work. They were joined by hundreds of thousands more, conscripted farmers, convicted criminals, captured prisoners of war. At its height, the wall-building project of the Qin dynasty may have employed as many as 1 million workers across its entire length. Let us sit with that number for a moment. 1 million people on a wall. Try to imagine what that looked like across the landscape. In the mountain sections, workers clinging to steep slopes, hauling earth and stones by hand, step by step up angles that would challenge a modern climber with good equipment. In the flatter northern sections, the wall stretching across the plain, lines of workers moving in the same rhythm that those ancient Neolithic village builders had once moved, driving their pounders down course by course. In the desert sections far to the west, the wall made not of rammed earth or stone but of packed layers of gravel and brushwood and clay. Whatever material the local landscape provided adapted with ingenuity and necessity. The wall was not a single thing. It was a continuous improvisation, thousands of miles long. In the mountains, the builders used stone. The mountains of northern China provided abundant stone. Granite in some areas, limestone in others, layers of ancient rock that could be cut and shaped and stacked. The stone walls were massive, 15 feet wide at the base in many sections, wide enough for 5 soldiers to walk abreast or for horses to be ridden along the top. The outer facing was carefully laid stone, mortared tight, rising in long, straight courses that follow the contours of the ridge. The inner filling was rubble and earth, packed dense and solid. Picture a crew working on a mountain section. A dozen men shaping stone with iron tools, the clang and scrape of metal on rock mixing with the wind that seems to blow constantly at this altitude. A chain of workers, perhaps 100 of them, in a long relay from the quarry to the building site, passing baskets and blocks from hand to hand up the slope. A foreman walking the line, checking levels, pointing where the next course needs to go. At night, these workers sleep in shelters built against the rising wall itself, sharing body heat against the cold that comes down from the mountains even in summer at this height. There is very little celebrating. There is very little that feels like history being made. There is only the work and the next stone and the mountain wind. The lives of these workers are largely invisible to us now. They did not write memoirs. Their names were not recorded in the official histories, which were interested in emperors and generals, not in labourers. What we know of them comes from archaeology, from the graves that have been found near the wall, simple burials without the elaborate goods of the wealthy, the bones of men who died young, who were poorly fed, who worked in conditions that the imperial bureaucracy clearly cared about, only insofar as the wall needed to keep being built. There is a legend, very old, that the wall is built on the bones of the workers who died building it. This is not literally true. Archaeological excavation has not found the skeletons inside the wall that the legend implies. But it is true in a different and more important way. The suffering that built this wall was real. The scale of human cost, in labour, in health, in years of life, in the families kept apart, in the farmers who died far from their fields and their children, was staggering. This is something worth remembering as we walk along the wall in our imagination. Not to make it grim, but to make it honest. The wall is beautiful. It is also a monument to human cost, the way that all the great monuments of the ancient world are monuments to human cost, the weight of individual lives beneath the grandeur of collective achievement. And yet, and this is equally true, equally important, the people who built the wall were not entirely without agency, without dignity, without moments of grace. In the years they spent on the wall, they ate and slept and told stories. They made friends and enemies. They talked about their families, their homes, the taste of the food they missed. They complained about the food they were given. They sang, probably. It is almost impossible to imagine a large group of people doing hard rhythmic labour without singing. They watched the stars and the seasons turn above the great ridge of stone they were building into the world. Some of them, perhaps, felt a kind of pride in what they were making. Looking back down the line of the wall on a clear day, watching it stretch away into the distance, knowing that it was permanent, knowing that it would outlast them by centuries or millennia, that must have meant something, even to someone who had not chosen to be there. As the Qin dynasty's wall took shape, it was accompanied by a network of infrastructure that is easy to overlook, but was essential to the wall's function. Roads were built behind the wall, running parallel to it, allowing troops and supplies to move quickly from one section to another. Signal towers were placed at intervals, not just the watchtowers on the wall itself, but relay towers further south, each one in sight of the next, so that a signal begun at the eastern end of the wall could be communicated to the capital hundreds of miles away in a matter of hours, using a combination of fire and smoke signals. This communication network was, in its way, as impressive an achievement as the wall itself, a piece of information infrastructure laid across the entire northern frontier of an empire. The wall, in other words, was not just a barrier, it was a nervous system, a way of sensing and responding to what was happening along thousands of miles of frontier in near real time. Qin Shi Huang died in 210 before the Common Era, while on one of his inspection tours of his empire. He was 50 years old. He had been emperor for 11 years. The wall he had ordered was not finished. It would not be finished, in the sense of being complete and cohesive from one end to the other for centuries, and different dynasties would add and modify and expand it, so that the Great Wall is really a term for many walls built across many centuries in overlapping and adjacent lines. But the great project had been set in motion. The idea had been embedded in the landscape in a form that could not be easily undone. The dynasty he left behind fell quickly. Within 4 years of his death, the Qin Empire collapsed into civil war and was replaced by the Han dynasty, which would rule for 4 centuries and give its name to the Chinese people themselves. The Han emperors inherited the wall, repaired it, extended it westward into the deserts where the Silk Road was beginning to develop, staffed it with garrisons, administered it as a functioning border institution. But before we follow the wall into the Han era and the centuries of life that would unfold around it, the soldiers and the merchants and the farmers and the travellers, let us pause here for just a moment and feel the scale of what has been done. Somewhere in the mountains of northern China the sun is going down. The light is gold and then amber and then the deep clear blue of high-altitude dusk. A soldier stands in a watchtower, perhaps one of the soldiers Meng Tian brought north, now assigned to garrison duty for an indefinite term, living on the wall he helped build. He can see for miles in every direction. To the south, the green and cultivated lands of the empire, the smoke of village fires rising in the still evening air, the distant glint of a river. To the north, the open steppe, brown and wide and limitless, the grass moving in a wind that comes from somewhere very far away. He stands there for a long time, this soldier. He's thinking about his family, probably, in the village he came from 3 years ago. He's thinking about when his term of service will end and whether it will end. He's thinking about the food, which has been poor lately, and the cold that is already arriving earlier this year than last. But he is also, for a moment, not thinking about any of that. He's just standing in the tower, watching the steppe in the last of the light, feeling the stone of the wall beneath his feet, solid and cold and absolutely still, and listening to the wind. The wall runs east, below him, over the next ridge and the next one, all the way to the sea. The wall runs west, below him, into the desert and the distance and the far edge of the world he knows. He's standing at the boundary between two worlds. He is standing at the place the Empire defined itself, and in the morning, when the sun comes up again and the steppe shows itself in the early light, he will still be here, watching. As soldiers have always watched and will watch for centuries more from this same tower, on this same ridge, above this same extraordinary wall. The night comes on. The stars appear, one by one. The wall disappears into the dark, though you can feel it there, present and immense, running away in both directions into everything that cannot be seen. Just stone, just the mountain wind, just the oldest of human needs made permanent in the landscape, just the wall breathing quietly in the dark. But let us stay a little longer in this world, before we move forward into the centuries that follow. Let us stay in the Qin era, in the years of building, and try to understand what it felt like from the inside, not from the tower, but from the ground in the middle of the work itself. Imagine the wall being built through a mountain pass. The pass is narrow, no more than 60 feet wide at its narrowest point, the rock walls of the mountain rising steeply on either side, the sky reduced to a thin ribbon of blue above. Through this pass, for centuries before the wall, traders and travellers and herders had moved freely, following the natural pathway through the mountain. Now, the pass is a construction site. There are hundreds of workers here. You cannot see all of them because the pass curves and the sections further up the slope are hidden by the terrain. But you can hear them, the sound of stone being cut and shaped, a high ringing sound that bounces off the rock walls of the mountain and becomes strangely musical in the echo. The lower rhythmic thud of rammed earth, being tamped into sections of wall where stone is not available or not practical. The shouts and calls of the foreman, directing the chain of workers carrying materials from the quarry site further down the slope. Somewhere, a horn sounds, the signal for a rest period, or perhaps a warning that a section of scaffolding is about to be raised. The workers themselves look like men who have been here a long time and will be here longer still. Their clothes are worn to uniformity by labour and weather, the same dusty grey-brown as the stone they work with. Their hands are calloused to the point where they can handle rough rock without feeling it. They move with the economical, unhurried efficiency of people who have learned that the only way to get through a very large amount of work is to never rush and never stop. There is a wall section near the base of the pass that was finished last month. It is already beginning to look permanent, already beginning to look as though it has always been there, as though the mountain itself pushed it up from below, the way it pushed up the ridges and the peaks. The mortar between the stones is curing, hardening slowly in the mountain air. The surface is rough and slightly uneven, the marks of the stone cutters still visible on each block, but it is solid. You could push against it with all your strength and not feel it move, not even slightly. The wall has its own strange, almost living quality when it is being built at this scale. You can watch a section rise from nothing, from bare ground and a line of wooden stakes driven in to mark the course, over the space of weeks. You can watch the first course of stones go in, flat and careful, levelled with skill, each one chosen and placed. You can watch the second course go in on top of the first, each stone offset from the one below so the joints do not line up and the wall gains strength from its own pattern. You can watch the wall grow upward, foot by foot, day by day, until it reaches its full height and the battlements are set in place along the top, the rectangular crenellations that give the wall its distinctive silhouette, the gaps between the merlons just wide enough to shoot an arrow through, while the stone beside you absorbs whatever comes back. When a section is completed, it is simply the beginning of the next section. The workers move on. The finished wall stays. It stays in the rain and the frost and the wind of the mountain. It stays through winters when no one comes near it, when the snow piles against its base and ice forms in the cracks between the stones. It stays patient and indifferent, waiting for spring and the return of the soldiers who will man its towers. There is something worth thinking about in this, in the relationship between the people who built the wall and the wall that outlived them. The workers who built it were mostly ordinary people, farmers who were conscripted for their year of service, men who had no particular skill in stonework when they arrived and learned it on the job, slowly through practice and instruction. They did not sign their work. They were not celebrated. They went home, if they were lucky, when their time was done, and went back to their fields and planted their millet and lived out the rest of their lives in the ordinary way, and died and were buried and were forgotten. But the wall remembered them, not in the way that history books remember great men, with names and dates and attributed achievements, but in the older, quieter way that stone remembers the hands that shaped it. The marks of the tools are still there in the face of the blocks if you look closely enough. These slight imperfections that tell you which way the hammer fell, which angle the chisel was held at, how the worker adjusted his grip as the stone gave way beneath him. These are not inscriptions, they are not records, they are just the trace of a particular hand, on a particular day, in a particular mountain pass doing the work of making something that would last. The wall is the memory of 10,000 ordinary moments pressed into stone. It is also the memory of a landscape. The line that the wall follows through the mountains of northern China is not arbitrary. It follows the ridges, the spines of the mountains, placing itself at the highest point available for as long as possible, before dropping to cross a valley and climbing the next ridge. Whoever planned this route, and it was planned carefully by men who walked the terrain before a single stone was placed, had an intimate understanding of the land. They knew which ridges commanded the longest sight lines. They knew which valleys were the natural crossing points, where any force coming from the north would be funneled by the terrain into a predictable path. They knew where the water sources were, critical for any garrison that would have to live along the wall indefinitely. The wall follows this knowledge through the landscape. It flows through the mountains the way a river flows through them, taking the path that the land itself suggests. In this way, the wall is a collaboration between human ambition and natural geography, between the will of an emperor and the reality of stone and slope. No single mind planned it. No single person could have. It was planned by the land as much as by the people who read it. And when you stand on the wall today, when you climb the stone steps of one of the Ming dynasty's beautifully preserved sections in the mountains north of Beijing, and you reach the top and look out in both directions, watching the wall climb and dip and wind away through the mountains seemingly forever, what you feel, if you're the kind of person who feels things in stone and landscape, is exactly that. Not the imposition of human will on nature, but the expression of something the land itself seems to have been waiting for, as though the mountain range always wanted a spine and the wall simply provided it. This is the gift the first emperor gave to the world, whether he meant to give it or not. Not just a military barrier, not just an administrative boundary, not just a proof of his own power and ambition. He gave the landscape a voice. He gave the mountains a line. He made the boundary visible. He made the border real. And now it is real, and the night is settling over it, and the stars are coming out one by one above the ridge, The soldier in the tower is still watching. The wind still moves across the steppe to the north, carrying the faint smell of grass and distance and open sky. The wall does not sleep. It does not need to. It is patient in the way that only stone can be patient. Not the patience of someone waiting for something to happen, but the patience of something that exists entirely outside of time. It will be there in the morning. It will be there in 100 years. It was there 100 years before this moment. And soon we will follow the wall through its centuries of life, the soldiers and their routines, the farmers who grew their crops in its shadow, the merchants who passed through its gates on the great trading routes that would one day connect China to the Roman world. We will feel the seasons turn around it. We will watch what it means in the long life of a civilization to have a wall, but for now there is only the stone and the dark and the wind, and somewhere in the distance, far to the north, the steppe rolls on under the same stars, wide and quiet and without walls, going on until it becomes the sky. Rest now. Let the day go. Let the weight of it dissolve the way the light dissolves at the end of a long mountain afternoon. Slowly, gradually, until it is just softness and dark and the sound of the wind in the high places where the wall stands. You're in good hands tonight. The oldest of stories is holding you, and the wall is there, in the dark, exactly where it has always been. Dawn comes slowly to the wall. It does not arrive all at once, the way it sometimes feels like it does in a city, where the lights flick on and the noise begins and suddenly it is morning. Up here, in the mountains, the light returns the way water returns to a dry riverbed after rain. First a faint brightening at the edge of the sky, almost imperceptible, more a loosening of the dark than a presence of light. Then gradually the ridges take shape, black against grey, and the wall becomes visible again. The long familiar line of it, picking out the spine of the mountain, running east and west into the distance. The soldier in the watchtower has been awake for hours. He watched the stars rotate overhead during his watch, tracking the slow movement of the sky the way his grandfather taught him. The great northern star holding still while everything else turned around it, a wheel with a fixed axle. He knows when it's close to dawn not by looking at the sky but by feeling it. Something in the air changes in the hour before first light. The cold deepens briefly, as though the night is gathering itself for one last effort before surrendering. The wind drops. The steppe to the north goes very still. He stirs the embers of the small fire he keeps in the corner of the tower. He adds a piece of wood, dry pine, stored under a shelf out of the weather. The fire responds immediately, bright and grateful. He crouches over it for a moment, warming his hands. Below him, in the rooms built into the wall itself and in the low barracks that cluster against the south face, the garrison is beginning to move. These men, perhaps 30 of them in this section, spread across 2 towers and the rooms between, have been here long enough that their days have settled into a routine as regular and reliable as the seasons. Rising before dawn, the watch rotation, the morning meal, the inspection of the wall section for any damage from the night, frost heave in winter, settling after rain in other seasons, the daily maintenance that a structure of this scale and age constantly requires. The wall needs tending. This is something that surprises people when they think about it, because we imagine great monuments as self-sufficient, needing nothing. But stone moves. Mortar cracks in the freeze-thaw cycle of mountain winters. Drainage channels, the ones that carry rainwater off the walkway and away from the wall's foundation, clog with debris and must be cleared, or the water backs up and works its way into the wall itself. And in winter, that water expands as it freezes and can fracture even very thick stone. The watchtowers need their floors swept, their fireplaces cleaned of ash, their supply of firewood and signal materials replenished. The gates need their hinges oiled. The wooden bridges over the drainage channels need to be checked for rot. A garrison on the wall was in large part a maintenance crew, but it was also a community, and this is something worth pausing to think about. Because the life of the wall was not only a life of duty and vigilance. For the men who lived and worked along it for years at a stretch, it was simply life, the full, ordinary, sometimes boring, sometimes surprisingly rich texture of everyday human existence, conducted in an extraordinary setting. Think about what those men knew. They knew this stretch of wall the way you know the rooms of a house you have lived in for years, every crack, every section of uneven floor, every place where the wind comes through when it blows from the northwest, every stone step that is slightly higher than the others and catches your foot if you're not paying attention. They knew the landscape around the wall with the same intimate familiarity. They knew which direction the deer came from in the early morning. They knew which ridge to the north sometimes showed the smoke of cook fires in the autumn, meaning a large group was camped out there. They knew the sound the wall made in a strong wind, a low, deep resonance that you could feel in your feet if you stood on the walkway and closed your eyes. They cooked their food in small clay stoves, burning charcoal and dried dung and wood when wood was available. The food itself was simple and monotonous by the standards of what they might have eaten at home. Millet gruel, dried vegetables, salt fish, beans. Occasionally, if the season and the posting were fortunate, fresh meat from hunting. The garrison. Soldiers did hunt, not only because it supplemented their diet, but because it broke the long stretches of sameness that were the true challenge of garrison life. Not the danger, which was real but intermittent, but the sameness. The days that were exactly like the days before. There were also, attached to the wall at regular intervals, small farming settlements. The emperors, particularly the Han Dynasty emperors who invested enormously in the wall and its supporting infrastructure, understood that a garrison you had to feed entirely from the south was expensive and logistically complicated. They actively encouraged, and sometimes compelled, farming communities to settle near the wall. They offered land grants to soldier farmers who would serve part-time in the garrison and spend the rest of their time cultivating the fields in the protected valleys behind the wall. These communities grew up in the shelter of the wall the way moss grows on the shaded side of a stone, slowly, quietly, finding the microclimate created by the structure itself. The wall blocked the worst of the north wind. It provided a sense of security that no open landscape could match. It gave the community a reason to exist and a structure around which daily life could organize itself. Picture one of these settlements in the late afternoon of a summer day. The fields are full, millet and sorghum, tall and heavy. A group of women are at work in a kitchen garden nearer the settlement, weeding in the comfortable, unhurried way of people who have been doing this same task their whole lives and are in no particular hurry. Children run between the houses. A dog lies in a doorway, watching the world with the philosophical detachment of all dogs everywhere. From the direction of the wall, perhaps half a mile away across the fields, comes the occasional distant sound of the garrison, a shout, a horn, the clang of something metallic, sounds that are so familiar they barely register. The farmers knew the soldiers. They traded with them. Vegetables and fresh grain for small manufactured goods, metal tools, sometimes news from the south, sometimes letters that the soldiers carried when they rotated in and out of their postings. The soldiers sometimes married into the farming communities. Children grew up knowing both worlds, the civilian world of the fields and the village, and the military world of the wall with its towers and its watches and its disciplines. There were the small unofficial markets that sprang up near the busier gates, the way that commerce always springs up wherever people regularly gather. A woman who lived near the eastern gate had been selling dumplings and hot soup to travellers waiting to pass through for 20 years. Her stall was a simple structure, a table, a fire, a large clay pot always simmering. but it was known to everyone who used that gate regularly, soldiers and merchants and local farmers alike. She knew which officials liked their soup heavily seasoned and which preferred it plain. She knew by the number of people waiting whether the gate would be slow today or fast. She had, over 2 decades, accumulated a quiet understanding of the wall and its rhythms that no official document contained, because it was the understanding of someone who watched rather than recorded. This is the kind of life the wall produced and sustained, outside the records and the official histories. Not just the great events, the raids repelled, the trade taxed, the dynasties that came and went, but the small daily life of ordinary people whose world was shaped by this structure, the woman with her soup pot, the farmer whose field ended at the base of the wall's south face, who sometimes found soldiers sitting on the boundary stone in the evening watching the sunset, the children who grew up thinking of the watchtower on the ridge as a natural feature of their landscape, no more requiring explanation than the mountain it stood on. The wall was always most itself, not in the moments of drama, the signal fires lit in emergency, the gate slammed shut against a threat from the north, but in the long, ordinary stretches in between, when it was simply there and the life around it was simply lived, and the days passed as days have always passed, one after another, unremarkable and irreplaceable. There was a rhythm to the year along the wall that was not very different from the rhythm of the year anywhere else in the agricultural world of ancient China. Spring was for planting, and for the heightened alertness that came with the season. The steppe people tended to move south in spring, following the grass as it greened, and spring sometimes brought visitors to the wall, both the peaceful and the otherwise. Summer was for cultivation and for maintenance, for repairs done in the dry warmth before the autumn rains. Autumn was for harvest and for preparation, storing food, laying in wood and fuel, checking and rechecking the signal systems before the hard months arrived. Winter was long and cold and quiet, and the wall in winter was a place of profound, almost supernatural stillness, the snow lying thick on the walkway, the towers draped in ice, the landscape reduced to black and white and the grey of the stone. But even in winter there was warmth inside the garrison rooms. Even in the coldest months there was the fire and the food and the conversation, the games of chance played with knuckle bones, the stories told and retold until they were as worn and comfortable as old clothing. There were letters from home, not many and not frequent, because the postal system of the empire was real but imperfect, and letters could take weeks or months to arrive. But they came, eventually, and when they did, they were read and reread, shared with the men nearby. The words of a wife or a mother passed around the room like something precious, which of course they were. The wall made people lonely, and it made them close to each other, both at once. The isolation of a remote mountain posting drew men together in ways that ordinary social life rarely managed. You knew your garrison mates in the full, unvarnished way of people who have eaten together and worked together and been cold together and afraid together for long enough that there is nothing left to hide. There were records from garrison duty during the Han Dynasty, wooden strips on which soldiers wrote notes and letters, and administrative records, preserved by the remarkable dryness of the Gobi Desert where the western stretches of the wall pass through, that give us glimpses of these lives. A soldier writing to request that money be sent from home, a foreman recording how many tools were issued to his section, a personal note, perhaps a letter never sent, in which a man describes the landscape around his posting in language that is surprisingly careful and exact. The way the light comes off the desert at certain hours, the appearance of a migratory bird that stopped briefly near the tower and then moved on. These wooden strips, thousands of them have been excavated from sites along the western wall in the deserts of Gansu and Xinjiang, are one of the most intimate historical records the ancient world has left us. They preserve the texture of ordinary life at the wall in a way that official histories never could. A requisition for arrows, a report of a fire at a neighbouring watchtower, a list of men who owed money to the garrison quartermaster, a tally of the days of the month with the weather noted against each one: clear, overcast, wind from the north, light rain in the afternoon. One strip, found in the early 20th century and now carefully preserved, contains what appears to be a personal list. The kind of list a person makes not for official purposes but for themselves. Items of clothing that need replacing, the name of a person in a distant town, a number that might be a debt or might be a distance. Whatever it meant to the man who wrote it, it is now a small bright window into a mind that lived on the wall more than 2,000 years ago, worried about the same small practical things that all people worry about, writing them down in the way that people have always written things down when they need to hold them. These men were literate, this is worth noting. The Han dynasty invested heavily in education and the spread of writing throughout its administrative systems, and a posting on the wall, however remote, required men who could read orders and write reports. The wooden strip records found in the Gobi are not the notes of a handful of educated elites. They are the routine administrative documents and personal writings of ordinary soldiers and officers doing their jobs and living their lives on the edge of the empire. They were ordinary people in an extraordinary place, and the place shaped them, over the years of their service, in ways they might not have been able to articulate. The vastness of the landscape, the depth of the sky at altitude, the particular quality of silence that you only get in very remote places, a silence that is not the absence of sound but a presence in itself, the feeling of standing somewhere that matters, not in the abstract political way that an official might describe it, but in the immediate physical way that a person feels when they stand at a boundary and look out at the world on both sides. The wall was real to these men in a way it is not real to most of us. We look at images of it and feel wonder. They lived it. They swept it and repaired it and complained about it. They were bored by it for months at a time and then, very occasionally, grateful for it in the way that you're only grateful for a thing when you understand what the alternative would have been. This was the life of the wall, not dramatic mostly, not grand mostly, just life, complicated and simple and full of small pleasures and long tediums and the occasional moment of pure wordless awe. Just people in an extraordinary place getting on with it. Now let us follow someone through the gate, not a soldier, not a farmer, a merchant, a man who has made this journey, or one's very much like it many times before. He knows the gate in the wall the way a sailor knows a harbour. He knows its routines, its officials, the best time of day to arrive, the gifts and courtesies that smooth the process. He has loaded his animals, a string of camels, 4 of them, and 2 horses for riding, with goods that he intends to carry through the gate and beyond, north and west, into the vast trading networks of the steppe and beyond, and he has brought with him, from the north, goods that the empire wants. Let us meet him in the early morning, before the gate opens, while he waits with the small group of other travellers who have accumulated overnight at the base of the wall. There are perhaps 20 people here, a few merchants like himself, some with smaller loads, some with donkeys rather than camels. A small family group, man and woman and 2 children, with a cart piled with household goods, moving for reasons that are not entirely clear, as people always have moved and always will. A monk sitting very still near the wall itself, eyes closed, apparently indifferent to the weight. The merchant watches the gate with the practiced patience of someone who has learned that gates open when they open and not before, and that anxiety about this fact changes nothing. He's been waiting at gates his whole life. He is, if he is honest with himself, more comfortable in the in-between spaces, the spaces of transit, of waiting, of movement, than he is in any fixed place. He belongs to the road the way that the soldiers belong to the wall. What is he carrying? On the way south, he has pelts, the dense, winter-thick furs of animals caught far out on the steppe. He has horses, not the horses he is riding, but additional horses, 4 of them, led on rope behind the last camel. Horses from the steppe were prized in China, bigger and stronger than the Chinese breeds, enormously valuable to a military that needed cavalry. They were one of the most important commodities moving through the wall gates, flowing south in exchange for everything the steppe lacked. He also has small quantities of a mineral dye that is extracted by certain steppe peoples from rocks in the far northwest, a brilliant blue-green that the craftsmen of the Chinese cities value highly. On the way north, he carries silk. The silk is packed in waterproof wrapping inside the large pannier baskets on the camels' backs, protected from moisture and damage. There is not very much of it by weight. Silk is extraordinarily light for its value. But by value it represents the bulk of what he is trading. The rolls of cloth in those baskets are the product of months of labour by the silkworm farmers and the weavers of the south. They are smooth as water and strong as tendon. They are coloured with dyes, deep crimson, saffron yellow, the dark blue of certain flowers, and some of them are patterned with woven designs of birds and clouds and geometric borders. They are, in a word, miraculous. They are like nothing else the ancient world produced, and the ancient world knew it. Silk was China's great secret for centuries. The West knew about it. Roman senators wore Chinese silk robes and were occasionally criticized by more austere colleagues for the extravagance. But the West did not know how it was made. The Chinese government guarded the secret of sericulture, the raising of silkworms and the reeling of their thread, with something close to the jealousy of a state monopoly. The penalty for smuggling silkworm eggs or mulberry seeds, the essential ingredients, out of China was, at various points in history, death. The merchant does not think about any of this as he waits for the gate to open. He thinks about whether the camels need water, and whether the horse trader he's supposed to meet on the other side of the wall will honour their agreed price, and whether the small ache in his right knee that has been with him for a week now means anything to worry about or nothing at all. The gate opens. The official who oversees the gate is a man of middle age, careful and slightly tired, who has been doing this job for 4 years and has another year to go before he can apply for a transfer. He knows the merchant. This is not the first time they have stood on either side of this particular exchange. He examines the merchant's documents, the travel permit issued by the county administration, the inventory of goods, the record of previous crossings. He notes the horses. He asks a few questions, writes a few things on his own records. He collects the gate tax, a small percentage of the estimated value of the goods, payable in coin or in kind. Then he gestures the merchant through. The merchant leads his animals through the gate, through the tunnel in the body of the wall itself, and out the other side. The sound changes immediately as he passes through, the slight echo and compression of the tunnel giving way to the open air of the other side, and with the open air comes something else, a different quality of space. The world to the north of the wall is wider. The sky is more present. The horizon is further away. The sense of enclosure that the farming landscape provides, hedges and field boundaries and the walls of buildings, is simply absent. The steppe begins almost immediately, the grass starting at the edge of the rammed earth road that runs north from the gate and continuing without interruption as far as he can see. This is the Silk Road. Not the road in the narrow sense, this stretch of beaten earth and gravel that runs north from the gate. That is just one segment, one thread in a network so large and so old that calling it a single road is a little like calling the ocean a single river. The Silk Road was a web of trade routes that connected China to Central Asia, to Persia, to the Arabian Peninsula, to India, to the Eastern Mediterranean, to Rome. It ran for thousands of miles in multiple branches, some through deserts and some through mountains and some across the open steppe. It carried silk west and gold east. It carried spices and glass and wool and iron and horses and camels and cotton and lapis lazuli and amber and, invisibly but perhaps most importantly, ideas. Buddhism travelled the Silk Road from India into China. So did early Islam centuries later. So did plague, in both directions, multiple times. So did paper-making technology, moving west from China along the same routes that silk had travelled for centuries before. So did mathematical concepts, astronomical knowledge, musical instruments, crop varieties, architectural techniques. The Silk Road was not just an economic network. It was the nervous system of the ancient world, the medium through which the civilizations of Eurasia remained, despite all their differences and distances, in continuous conversation with each other, and the wall was its gateway. The wall was the place where all of this movement was channeled, monitored, taxed, and managed. Every merchant who moved between the Chinese world and the worlds beyond passed through a gate in the wall. Every load of silk, every string of horses, every bundle of furs, every roll of cotton from India, every ingot of gold from Persia, all of it came through the gates. All of it was recorded by the officials in their administrative posts. All of it left its small mark in the wooden strip records and the official ledgers of the empire. The wall made this possible in a way that is easy to overlook if you think of the wall only as a military structure. Without the wall, without the defined and supervised boundary it created, the movement of trade between China and the steppe world would have been harder to manage, harder to tax, harder to protect. Merchants needed security. They needed to know that the road was watched, that the gate was there, that on the Chinese side of the wall the emperor's law ran and a trader had rights and recourse. The wall was the guarantee of civilization, the promise that the controlled world extended at least this far. Beyond the wall, the merchant was on his own. He knew this. He had guides, men of the steppe who knew the roads and the water sources and the politics of the various groups whose territory the road passed through. He had relationships, built over years of trading, with the leaders of different groups. He had a reputation for honest dealing that was, in many ways, more valuable than any document the Chinese government could issue. On the steppe, reputation was everything. A man known to trade fairly could travel in relative safety. A man known to cheat had made enemies that no official document would protect him from. He moved north, his animals falling into the comfortable road pace they settled into after the first mile or so, not hurrying, not dawdling, just covering the ground with the patient efficiency of creatures built for long travel. The camels, in particular, moved with the slightly superior air of animals who know they are perfectly suited to their environment and see no reason to make a fuss about it. They could drink once every several days, carry enormous loads relative to their size, navigate terrain that broke horses and mules, and keep moving through heat and cold and wind and dust with a calm indifference that the merchant sometimes envied. The road north was different in different seasons. In autumn it was golden, the steppe grass turning colour, the sky a hard, brilliant blue above it, the air dry and clear and carrying the faint cold smell that meant winter was several weeks away but thinking about it. In summer it was hot, the dust rising in small whirlwinds from the surface of the road, the horizon shimmering in the heat, the air so still that the sound of the camels' feet on the ground seemed unnaturally loud. In spring it was alive, the grass green and thick, wildflowers scattered across the steppe in colours that seemed too vivid to be real, birds everywhere, the air full of the smell of growth and wet earth. The merchant had seen all of these seasons on this road, and on roads like it, for 20 years. He had learned to appreciate each one for what it was without wishing for another. A man on the road has to make peace with the conditions he finds, because the conditions are not adjustable. This is, he has sometimes thought, a kind of wisdom that settled people rarely develop. You cannot move the wall, you cannot change the season, you can only adjust yourself to what is. The trading post where he would spend the next several nights was 2 days' travel north of the gate. It was a cluster of buildings, some permanent, made of adobe brick, and some semi-permanent, yurts and large tents that could be moved when their owners moved, at a point where 2 routes intersected near a reliable water source. It had been a trading place since before anyone could remember, since before the wall existed. The wall had not created it. It had simply formalized it, made it more organized, given it a relationship to the administrative structure of the empire to its south. At the trading post, languages mixed. Chinese was spoken, of course, but also several forms of the languages of the steppe peoples, and Sogdian, the great merchant language of Central Asia, spoken from the borders of China to the borders of the Roman world, the lingua franca of the Silk Road itself. The Sogdian merchant was something remarkable, a man of no particular empire, of no fixed home, who belonged to the road the way the road belonged to the steppe, at home in 6 languages and comfortable in every culture from China to Persia. The Sogdians were the true children of the Silk Road, the ones who held the whole network in their heads and kept it running. At the trading post, the merchant would find what he was looking for. He would trade his silk for more horses. He would sell his dye to a craftsman who knew what to do with it. He would hear news from the West, who had died, who had risen, which routes were safe and which had become dangerous, what was in demand and what was oversupplied. He would eat unfamiliar food and sleep in an unfamiliar bed, and wake the next morning in a world that was not quite Chinese and not quite steppe, and had its own identity, shaped by centuries of exchange. There was a kind of trust that operated in these trading places that is easy to underestimate from the distance of history. There was no court of law to appeal to in the middle of the steppe. There were no enforceable contracts, no system of written guarantees that crossed the cultural boundaries between the Chinese world and the worlds of the steppe and Central Asia. What there was instead was reputation and relationship, the slow accumulation of small-kept promises, fair dealings, and returned favours that, over years, became something as solid as any legal document. The merchant you cheated once would remember. The community of traders he belonged to would know. On the Silk Road your name travelled faster than you did, in both directions. This meant that the relationships built along the road were in many ways deeper and more carefully maintained than business relationships in more legally formalised societies. A man who traded with you honestly for 10 years was not just a commercial contact. He was a kind of kin, someone whose children you might help, whose relatives you might host, whose trouble you would step in to assist with, not because a contract required it, but because the relationship required it. The road created its own social fabric, its own web of obligation and care stretched across thousands of miles and dozens of different languages and cultures. The goods themselves carried this web from place to place. The silk that left a Chinese weaver's workshop in the Yangtze Valley and arrived months later in a Roman senator's wardrobe in the city of Rome had passed through perhaps a dozen pairs of hands on its journey. Each transaction was a thread in the fabric. Each merchant who handled it had their own name and their own reputation, and their own network of relationships that extended the fabric further. The silk was not just cloth. It was connection. It was the material evidence that the world was larger and more connected than any one person could see from where they stood. The wall, back to the south, would be visible on clear days. A thin, dark line along the top of the ridges, impossibly distant, impossibly still. From out here, it looked different than it did up close. From up close, it was stone and mortar and gatehouse and garrison, and all the human busyness of a living institution. From out here, from the steppe, it looked like what it was. A mark on the horizon. A line. The edge of one world and the beginning of another. The merchant looked at it sometimes, from out on the road, and felt something he could not quite name. Not nostalgia exactly, though there was an element of that. Not longing, though that was part of it too. Something more like recognition. The feeling you get when you see from a distance the place where one thing ends and another begins. The shoreline, the tree line, the snow line. And something in you responds to that boundary with a quiet, wordless attention. The wall is always there, behind you and ahead of you, on every journey. The boundary between the known and the unknown, between safety and openness, between the life you have built and the world that exists beyond it. It is a curious thing, this quality the wall has of meaning, different things to different people. To the soldier manning the gate, it is duty and routine and the weight of responsibility. To the farmer whose fields run to its southern base, it is shelter and certainty, the backdrop of a whole life. To the merchant passing through, it is threshold, the moment of transition between two worlds, the place where one set of rules gives way to another. And to the nomadic herder who approaches it from the north, leading his horses to the trading gate in autumn, it is something else again. A door, sometimes open, sometimes closed, into a world of settled warmth and grain and manufactured things, a world whose rules he does not entirely understand, but whose products he needs. All of these people are right about the wall. It is all of these things at once. A border is never just a line. A border is all the people who stand on either side of it, and all the people who cross it, and all the meanings they bring to that crossing. The wall is the sum of every human life it has ever been part of, which by now, across 2,000 years, is a number beyond calculation. But all numbers come down eventually to single moments, single days, single people standing in a particular place feeling a particular thing. The merchant at his trading post, looking south at the distant line on the ridge. The soldier at his gate watching the morning traffic begin. The farmer watching the smoke of a signal fire rise from the tower in the evening. Wondering, always wondering what it means and whether it means anything today. And then deciding it means nothing today and going back to his field. These are the moments the wall is made of underneath all the stone. If you're listening to this in the quiet of your night, finding these ancient roads and distant landscapes exactly what you needed, it would mean so much if you liked this video and subscribe to the channel. These long journeys through history take time to make, and your support is what makes them possible. You can do it now or whenever feels right without breaking the quiet of this moment. Just know that it helps, more than you might think. Now, let us follow the wall through all its seasons. The wall has known every season 1,000 times over. Let it show you. It is January, and the wall is cold in a way that goes beyond temperature. The cold is not just in the air here. It is in the stone itself, which has been losing heat since October, and is now, in the deep midwinter, as cold as the mountain from which it was cut. The mortar between the stones is white with frost in the early morning, each joint outlined in fine crystal. The walkway at the top of the wall is sheeted in ice where meltwater from the afternoon sun refroze at nightfall. And the garrison soldiers wear thick-soled boots that grip the ice without slipping. Their breath comes in great clouds of steam that disappear almost immediately in the dry, cold air. Snow has fallen in the night, perhaps 8 inches of it, soft and windless, settling evenly on every surface. The top of the wall is a long, unbroken stripe of white, broken only by the dark rectangles of the watchtower roofs and the small dark figures of the sentries. The steppe to the north is also white, entirely white, white all the way to the horizon, so that on overcast days it is difficult to tell where the land ends and the sky begins. The world has been simplified to 3 colours: the white of the snow, the grey of the stone and the sky, the dark of the pine trees on the southern slopes. Sound travels differently in this cold. The crunch of boots on ice is loud and sharp. A voice carries further than it should. Far to the north a fox calls, a short, rasping sound that carries across the still air for what seems like miles. The wall answers nothing. The wall is always quiet in winter more than any other season. It holds the cold the way a vessel holds water, concentrating it, keeping it long after the season might otherwise have moved on. The soldiers who work winter duty on the wall have learned to love certain things about it. They love the clarity of the winter sky at night, when there is no dust in the air and no moisture, and the stars are so sharp and close that you feel you could put your hand through the sky and touch them. They love the silence of snowfall, the way it absorbs all sound and creates briefly a world of absolute peace. They love, if they are honest, the way the cold drives men together. The warmth of the garrison room is a shared warmth, and there is a pleasure in that, in the simple, animal comfort of being warm among people who are also warm. Now it is April, and the wall has changed its character completely. The snow is gone from the south-facing slopes, though it lingers in the deep shadows on the north side and in the crevices between stones where the sun never reaches. The steppe to the north is showing its first green, a faint flush of colour at the base of the old dead grass, the new growth pushing up from the roots that survived the winter. There are birds. Suddenly there are birds everywhere, moving through in great restless waves of migration, small warblers and finches and thrushes pausing briefly on the wall itself before moving on north and west and south. A pair of red-tailed kites circles the valley below the wall without effort, riding thermals that are beginning to develop as the ground warms. The garrison is busy in spring. Repairs that were postponed through the hard months now must be done. Sections of wall where frost has cracked the mortar, drainage channels blocked by ice that is finally thawing, timber structures that have been weakened by the weight of snow. There is an urgency to spring maintenance that winter lacks. In winter, a cracked section of wall is simply noted and monitored. In spring, it must be fixed before the summer brings traders and travellers and whatever else the warmer months bring, and the wall must be whole. The nearby farming settlements are also busy in spring, and there is a correspondence between the rhythms of the garrison and the rhythms of the farms, both responding to the same turning of the season, both accelerating from the winter's slowness into the focused activity of planting and preparation. The smoke from the village hearths rises higher in the warming air. The sound of children playing comes faintly to the soldiers on the wall, carried by the spring wind that is gentle and warm from the south in April, a different wind entirely from the bitter north wind of winter. July, and the wall is the colour of the land around it, the same dry golden brown of the summer steppe, the same dusty grey of the mountain stone baked by weeks of direct sun. The heat is real here, even at altitude. The stone of the walkway is hot enough in the early afternoon to be uncomfortable through the soles of boots. The garrison soldiers do most of their outdoor work in the early morning and in the evenings, resting in the shade of the towers during the middle of the day. The steppe shimmers in the heat, the horizon dissolving into haze, but the wall in summer is also alive in a way it is not in other seasons. The cracks in the mortar are full of small flowers, low-growing, tough-stemmed plants that have found their precarious foothold in the mineral-rich mortar and will not be dislodged. Lizards sun themselves on the south face in the morning, disappearing so quickly when disturbed that they seem to dissolve into the stone. A pair of swallows has built a nest in a recess under the eaves of the eastern watchtower, and the garrison has grown fond of them. Watching the daily activity of their lives, with the interest that people take in any domestic life smaller and simpler than their own. The traders are more active in summer. The gate sees more traffic in July and August than in any other months. Caravans pass through on their long journeys, stopping at the garrison for water and sometimes for news. The merchant with his camels comes and goes. Smaller traders, local people from the steppe settlements just north of the wall, trading cattle and dairy products for grain and tools, cross on a nearly daily basis. The official at the gate sits in the shade of the gate arch and processes his documents and collects his taxes and watches the world flow past him with the equanimity of a man who has understood, finally, that the world is always flowing, and his job is simply to note it down. September arrives, and the wall exhales. The heat breaks first at night, a coolness in the air after sunset that is not quite autumn yet, but is no longer summer either. The light changes. The evenings are golden in a way they are not in other months, the low sun catching the stone of the wall at a long angle and warming it to amber, every joint and crack made visible by the raking light. The steppe turns almost overnight, from summer's burned gold to autumn's richer, deeper colour. Ochre and rust and the particular orange-brown of dried grass that has stood all summer in the wind. The harvest is happening in the farming settlements. The smell of it reaches the wall sometimes. Cut grain, the sweetness of ripe fruit, the smoke of the fires they build to process the harvest, the sharp smell of fermentation as the year's grain is turned into the stored food that will carry everyone through the winter. The soldiers on the wall can feel the season changing, not just in the temperature and the light, but in the sounds from the settlements, the particular busy industry of a community gathering itself for winter. There is a quality to autumn at altitude that is unlike autumn anywhere else. The air has a clarity that summer never achieves. The heat haze is gone, the dust has settled after the last dry months, and what remains is air so clear that distances that were blurred all summer are suddenly sharp and exact. Mountains you knew were there but could not quite see from the wall are suddenly present, ridge after ridge, receding into a blue so deep it is almost purple. The steppe to the north seems to extend even further than usual in autumn, the dried grass catching the low sun and holding it, glowing in the long afternoons with a warmth that the air itself no longer contains. This is the season when the wall shows itself most completely, not the season of hardship and drama, not the season of green and growth, but the middle season, the turning season, when everything is exactly and precisely what it is, with no concealment and no excess. Stone is stone, mountain is mountain, distance is distance. The wall runs across the ridgeline in the autumn afternoon, and it looks as though it has always been there and always will be, as natural and permanent as the mountain beneath it, as old as the sky above it. The soldiers who have served a full year on the wall often say, when they think about it afterward, that it was October they remembered most clearly. Not the hard winter months, not the busy summer, but October. The moment before everything changed again. The last of the warm days, the evenings drawing in, the first real fire of the season in the garrison room, the smoke rising straight up in the still air because the wind had for once gone quiet. The particular smell of the mountain in October, something dry and clean and slightly resinous, like old wood and stone and the last of the season's warmth releasing from the earth. One more thing before October ends and the year turns toward winter again, the moon in October. There is a festival, the Mid-Autumn Festival, celebrated throughout China at the full moon of the 8th lunar month, which falls by the solar calendar somewhere in September or October. It is a festival of reunion, of the harvest, of the round moon that to the Chinese has always symbolized wholeness and the gathering together of those who belong together. Families share mooncakes, round, dense pastries filled with sweet bean paste or lotus seed, and often a salted egg yolk at their centre, representing the moon itself. They sit outside in the evening and look at the moon together. On the wall, the soldiers observed this festival too, though they observed it far from home, far from the families and the mooncakes and the evening gatherings. They looked at the same moon, the same full, round, brilliant moon that their families were looking at in distant villages and cities. And in that shared looking they found, or tried to find, the connection that the distance denied them. It is one of the most poignant things about the life of the wall. All that distance, all that separation, and above it the same unchanging sky. The same moon, making its slow arc across the night, indifferent to the wall, indifferent to the distance, shining equally on the soldier and the family who missed him. And then, quietly, the cold returns. The wall settles back into itself. It knows this feeling. It has known it many times. The year turning, the cold coming, the world simplifying back to its essential forms, stone and sky and wind and the long brown line of the steppe stretching north into the distance. Every season for more than 2,000 years. Every October, every April, every July noon, and every January midnight. The wall has known them all. It holds them the way stone holds warmth, not forever, but for longer than seems possible. And now at last we are here. Not in any particular century, not in any particular dynasty, not in the Xin era with its rammed earth walls and its armies of labourers, not in the Han era with its garrisons and its Silk Road merchants, not even in the Ming dynasty, which rebuilt much of the wall in stone and brick between the 14th and 17th centuries, creating the version most people picture when they close their eyes and think of the Great Wall. We are simply here in the wall itself, in the quality of presence it has accumulated over all those centuries of being exactly what it is. The wall is quieter now than it has ever been in its long life. The garrisons are gone. The officials and their wooden strip records are gone. The merchant with his camels is gone, and so is the silk he carried, and the languages he spoke, and the trading post 2 days' ride north of the gate where he met his partners. The farming settlements that grew in the wall shelter have mostly dissolved back into the land, their foundations visible in certain lights but easy to miss. The steppe is still there, of course. The steppe is patient in ways that even the wall cannot match. What remains is the stone, and the stone is enough. There are sections of the wall today that are almost entirely unvisited, miles of it, in the remote mountain sections, where no road reaches and the terrain is too difficult for casual walking, where the wall has been returned by time to something close to its original condition. Not the manicured condition of the famous tourist sites, but the real condition, the working condition, the condition of a structure that has been exposed to 2,000 years of mountain weather without major intervention. The stone is dark with lichen, orange and grey and black. The lichen growing slowly over the centuries and becoming a kind of record of how long the wall has been here undisturbed. The mortar has crumbled in many places, and the stones have shifted slightly with the freeze-thaw cycles of 100 generations of mountain winters, so that the wall in these places is still standing but slightly irregular, slightly organic. The precision of its original construction softened by time into something that looks less built and more grown. In these places the wall breathes. That is the only word for it. You stand beside it, or on it, if the surface is still good enough to walk, and you feel that the stone is not dead. Stone is never dead, not really. It is simply slow. It changes on timescales that make human lives seem brief and bright, and very small. The minerals in the granite are moving, imperceptibly, rearranging themselves in response to temperature and pressure and chemical processes that have been underway since before the mountains themselves existed. The lichen is alive, growing a fraction of an inch per year. The water is moving through it, in the wet months, finding paths through the cracks that did not exist a century ago and will be larger a century from now. The wall is alive, slowly, in its own time, in the time of stone and mountain and the long, patient turning of geological ages. It is alive, and it is changing, and the change is so slow that it looks like stillness, which is perhaps the deepest definition of stillness there is. If you were to stand at one of the high points of the wall today, one of the remote, unvisited sections, somewhere in the mountains of Hebei or Shaanxi, in the early morning when the mist is still in the valleys below and the high ridges are just catching the first direct light, you would feel something that is very difficult to name, a kind of doubling, a sense of being present in two times at once. You're there in the present, in your body, with the cold of the morning air on your face and the particular smell of the mountain, stone and pine and something older, something mineral and ancient. And you were also somehow in the past, standing on the same stone that a Qin dynasty labourer tamped into place, that a Han dynasty soldier paced morning after morning, that a Ming dynasty bricklayer reset with careful hands. The same stone, the same mountain, the same sky. Time is strange near very old things. It does not feel linear, it feels layered, the way the geological strata of the mountain itself are layered, one era resting on the one before it, all the way down to the deep past where no human record goes. You're standing on all of that. The wall is under your feet, and it is also a kind of bridge, not between China and the steppe, not between north and south, but between now and then, between us and them, between the people who built it and the people who stand on it and feel, briefly, the strange vertiginous pleasure of touching something that connects them to a chain of human life stretching back further than they can see. This is what the Great Wall is, in the end. Not primarily a military structure, though it was that. Not primarily a political statement, though it was that too. Not primarily a monument to any single emperor or dynasty or moment of historical ambition. It is all of those things, yes, and it is also more than any of them. It is the record of a need. The oldest and most persistent of human needs, the need to draw a line around what you love, to say, this is our home, to protect it as best you can from whatever threatens it. The farmers along the Yellow River felt that need when they built their first small earthen ramparts around their villages. The kings of the warring states felt it when they built their frontier walls. The first emperor felt it with the particular intensity of a man who had unified an entire civilization and was newly aware of everything that could undo it. And all the soldiers and labourers and farmers and merchants and officials who lived and worked along the wall for 2,000 years felt it in their bones, every day, even when the wall was so familiar it had become invisible. This line is here for a reason. This boundary means something. The wall remains. Long after the dynasties that built it have dissolved back into history, long after the particular fears that drove its construction have changed beyond recognition, long after the Silk Road merchants and their camels are gone, and the garrisons are empty, and the farming settlements have returned to grass, the wall is still here, running over the ridges in the early light, stone by stone, section by section, generation by generation. The lichen on its face, the wind along its walkway, the same mountain sky above it that has always been above it. If you have ever felt the desire to protect something, If you've ever drawn a quiet boundary around the people or the place or the life that matters to you, if you have ever stood somewhere and thought, "This is mine, and I will care for it," then you have felt what the people who built this wall felt. You're part of the same long story, the same ancient impulse, working itself out across the centuries in 1,000 different forms. And if you've walked this quiet road all the way to the end, through the river valleys and the steppe, through the construction camps and the garrison rooms, through the trading posts and the changing seasons and the long, slow patience of the stone, then thank you truly. It would mean a great deal if you left a like before you close your eyes, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a gentle moment to do it. Comments are always welcome too. It's a quiet pleasure to read where in the world people are listening from, and what time it is there, and what the night sounds like outside your window tonight. We're always, somehow, listening together. For now, there is nothing left to do but rest. The wall is there, in the dark, exactly where it has always been. Running over the mountains in the night, stone by stone, from the sea in the east to the desert in the west, holding the line it has always held, asking nothing from you, expecting nothing from you, simply being what it is and has always been. Ancient, still, present. The wind moves across it, the way the wind has always moved across it, unhurried, without direction, belonging to no one. It finds the cracks between the stones and passes through them, barely disturbing anything, leaving no mark except the sound it makes, which is very faint and very old. Breathe with it. Let the mountains hold you. Let the stone hold the cold, the way it always has. Let the centuries settle around you like snow settling on the ridge, softly, without weight, covering everything in the same white quiet. The Great Wall has been standing for more than 2,000 years. It has watched dynasties rise and fall. It has watched the steppe people and the farming people negotiate and fight and trade and intermarry and slowly, over the long centuries, become something neither of them was before. It has watched the Silk Road fill with merchants and empty with plagues and fill again. It has watched winter come and go 1,000 times, and spring come and go 1,000 times, and the long amber afternoons of autumn come and go 1,000 times. It has watched the sky above it rotate through its nightly cycles, the same stars appearing in the same places each year, as reliable and indifferent as the mountain beneath it. It is still watching. Somewhere above the ridgeline, beyond the last watchtower, past the place where the wall disappears into the dark, the stars are out, the same stars. A little shifted by the long, slow wobble of the Earth's axis, the precession of the equinoxes, the astronomers call it, the very slow turning of the Earth's tilt over tens of thousands of years, but recognisably the same stars that the first builders watched from the scaffolding, that the Han Dynasty soldiers watched from the tower, that the Silk Road merchants navigated by, heading west into the dark. The same sky, the same stone, the same wind. You can let go now. The wall will still be there in the morning. It has always been there in the morning. It will be there long after morning, long after all our mornings, standing on its ridge above the steppe, patient and quiet and utterly at peace with the weight of time it carries. Let the day dissolve. Let the noise go. Let the breath slow and the mind loosen its hold on everything it has been carrying. There is nothing that needs holding tonight. Just the old story, settling around you like the dark. Just the stone and the wind and the long, long wall, breathing quietly in the mountains. Just that. Just rest.